Hello and welcome back to the Battle of White Plains custom multiplayer game. This is part number 7 and we're just going to do an examination of everything that happened in this battle because it was a fascinating and fun battle to watch from above, and I hope you enjoyed watching it through these after action report videos and everything I do with these maps. But let's really break this battle down because there is a lot of things here to unpack and to examine, because this was by far the closest game that I've ever done with these multiplayer teams. So the first thing that we're going to do is review the entire battle. And I'm just going to rotate through all the different turns here one last time so you can really see how the two armies moved and how this battle was fought from beginning to end. Alright, that is the final turn in this game. And what we're going to do now is look at the key decisions in this battle. Because in every battle that you play, in every battle I review, it's always interesting to go back and look at some of the key decisions which were made by the commanders and by the players involved. And then look at how those decisions shaped the entire outcome of the battle. So that's what we're going to do here because, again, this was the closest battle I've ever seen in any of my multiplayer games, and I think it's going to be fun to review just how we got to the result that we did. I'm going to start with turn number 1 because right at the very beginning, I think there was an opportunity missed by the Federals. The Federal side was presented with 4 different options to approach the battlefield before the game started. And that's one of the things I do in my multiplayer games. I give each side different plans which they can use. For the Federals, 3 of their 4 options included forces which arrived along the easternmost road and approached White Plains and Broad Run from the northeast. And when I created the different plans for the Federals to choose from, I really did assume that they would choose one of them which had forces coming on the easternmost road. Now, I truly believe that advancing on White Plains from 3 directions, instead of just 2 or 1 as it worked out in the end, would have greatly changed the battlefield situation. Had the Federals had troops on that easternmost road, they could have advanced on White Plains from that direction, which was on higher ground than White Plains. Or they could have gone towards Broad Run and really spread this battle out to a much larger geographic area. Instead, the Federals opted to use the only option, which ignored the easternmost road, and instead they advanced on a narrower front. And this was interesting because it allowed the Confederates, with the much smaller force, to more easily concentrate their limited numbers and guns against a more compact enemy army without ever worrying about their own flanks or rear. And I think that's a real benefit to the Southern armies in this battle. They never really worried at all about their flanks or their rear from beginning to end in this battle. The Federals just never challenged them anywhere except frontally at White Plains and later on at Midway. And the Federals had no way to know this. But Stonewall Jackson actually ignored the eastern road completely at the start. At the beginning of the game, he told his commanders, "I don't expect any grand flanking maneuvers by the Yankees, and do not believe they will approach using the more mountainous road to the east." Again, the Federals didn't know it, but had they advanced along one of these roads, they would have completely caught Stonewall Jackson off guard because that was not in his plan at all. He was fully expecting the Federals to advance north of White Plains and then towards Midway and Brooks Corner. Now, I don't know if that was just pure dumb luck for Stonewall Jackson or if he just had a sixth sense, but he did not think the Federals were going to advance from that direction, and as it turned out, he was right. But what if they did? This whole battle would be completely different, and I think the Federals would have had an advantage by using that road. Personally, I would have aimed only at Midway and White Plains if I was playing the Union. The Confederates would have abandoned Brooks Corner rather than try to defend both it and White Plains. Midway seems to be the key to all of that. In other words, if you're the Confederates, there is no possible way that you can hold both White Plains and Brooks Corner. It's impossible because of Midway. It is just super easy for the Federals to take Midway because they have the only direct road to that place. And once the Federal Army takes Midway, again, if you're the Confederates, you can't hold Brooks Corner and White Plains with the Federal Army having the interior lines and your own forces, which are already outnumbered, split and divided, and outside of supporting distance. So to me, taking Midway is the key for the Federals. By taking Midway, you automatically take Brooks Corner, and you ensure yourself of at least a draw in the battle. And I think after you take Midway and Brooks Corner by default, if you're the Federals, and you're attacking from the northeast, as I thought they should have, and from the north and from Midway, well then you would have had a lot of options to attack White Plains and gain that third objective. And you'd have higher ground north and northeast of the town, and don't forget, there's always Broad Run down to the southeast, which you could threaten also. So I just think right at the very beginning, the Federals probably didn't choose the best plan possible to achieve a victory here. Alright, we're going to look at another key decision in this battle, and to do that, I'm going to rotate the turns here a little bit and work up towards this point. So I'm just going to rotate here, and we're going to go to turn number 11, because I feel like that's the next point at which a key decision was made. And here we are, turn number 11. And during this turn, the Confederates attacked north of White Plains. And it was a bold move for them, and it was instantly successful. The Confederate attack in the rebel line was pushed far north of White Plains and Broad Run, and as it turned out, completely secured both of those places for the remainder of the battle. I don't think the Federals anticipated the Confederates being so aggressive north of White Plains, and they fell back really without too much of a fight. And when they fell back, they allowed the rebels to quickly turn their attention to the far larger threat against White Plains and Midway coming from the west. The Confederates shifted those units from Ewell's division, which were with Stark attacking north of White Plains, back to the west, and they were able to stall the Federal attack even before it got going. Not only stall the Federal attack, but launch their own in conjunction with A.P. Hill's division, which were the only troops then at Midway against two large Federal divisions. Had the Federals fought harder north of White Plains, despite being at a local disadvantage, it might have allowed the rest of the army more time to concentrate against the thin rebel lines west of White Plains. But because they fell back so quickly, it allowed Ewell to shift his troops and really change the dynamic of the battle. And another key decision actually came during the next turn. Both sides had planned to attack Midway at the same moment after their command meetings at 2 p.m. Both sides were supposed to attack. But Reynolds hesitated and preferred to wait until King's division arrived on his right flank. And this ended up allowing more time for the Confederates to concentrate and then eventually to take Midway. While they were moving, Reynolds was stalling. The Confederates attacking Midway were actually far fewer in number than those commanded by Reynolds. half of Ewell's division was still shifting back to the west after repulsing Federal forces north of White Plains. And at the time, I actually wrote the following. The decision to wait until King comes up by Reynolds may prove very important, as the rebels may strike first as a result. Will that benefit one side more than the other? At the time, maybe by waiting it does help the Federals, but it was a really risky move because you were just giving the Confederates more time, which they desperately needed. And in the end, this did allow the rebels the time that they needed to reach and then capture Midway, while Reynolds fell back and awaited support from first King and then Sykes' division. So despite having possession of Midway for a number of turns early in the battle, after falling back during this turn, the Yankees were never again able to reach Midway. I just feel like they gave up Midway too easily here, and they fell back when they didn't need to. They should have continued to fight along the Midway line and not allow the Confederates to even reach that objective point. Alright, moving forward to another key decision in this battle. I'm going to rotate the turns a number of times here. And you can see the Confederates have created themselves quite the salient there, but it was eventually closed by the Federals. And that brings us to turn number 17. With Sykes now in support of Reynolds, he would at last launch a belated attack against Midway in a very well-executed pincer movement with his division and Sykes's. And really, I think this was an excellent move to make, and it put the Confederates in a really bad position between two large Union forces which were both on better ground. And so, although before, yes, it was a mistake for Reynolds to delay, it almost paid off for them at this point. And at this point in the game, it really seemed like the Confederate army was about to be routed back from Midway towards White Plains, and it really felt like it was going to be a Union victory in the end because they had all this momentum going for them. And so what changed? Why was this not a Federal victory in the end? Well, as you can see, the Federals continued to make progress against the Confederate center for a number of turns. But then another key decision was made in this battle, and it might just be the most critical move made during this battle. With a ton of pressure on Ewell's division from two sides, the rebels had to do something, or they were going to be routed from Midway and were probably going to lose the battle. Ewell was just being pounded. Stark then began an unplanned counterattack on Ricketts' division and began to drive them back almost immediately. Despite having more men and guns and a better position with which to defend and fight, Ricketts opted to limber up all of his guns and to fall back. And when he limbered up all of his guns, I remember thinking that the reduction in Union firepower against Ewell's division was really going to be a benefit for the Confederates, because Ewell could not have held much longer caught in the crossfire that he was. Now at the time, Ricketts felt he could not hold out against the veterans of Stark. But if he could have just held on and fought Stark with his infantry while his guns continued to pound Ewell for a few more turns, it might have actually won the game for the Yankees. Sykes and Reynolds really were close to breaking Ewell, and Ewell had a lot of troops which were routing backwards, and his line was just crumbling apart. But as soon as Ricketts limbered up his guns and began to fall back, the Confederates were able to catch their breath and reestablish their line. Really, at this point, it felt like the Confederates were going to win this battle. Alright, we're going to move forward a couple more turns to turn number 22. Here, the Federals opted not to attack while Midway was still unoccupied. And this was a head-scratcher for me, because despite having a massive advantage in firepower near the objective, the Federals still did nothing. And this was the last and maybe the best chance for the Federals to have taken Midway at this stage in the battle. Over the next few turns, the objective would be increasingly guarded and protected. Moving forward now a few more turns, Really, the last thing I want to talk about is turn number 26. Because the Federals, once more, were just not aggressive enough with time running out in this battle. At this point, there's only 2 more turns left in the game. And they opted again not to attack around Midway, and I don't understand why. The Federals had easy wins all around the objective hex of Midway, against far smaller rebel units, but they did not take advantage of any of them. These were the units blocking Midway during turn number 26, and the Federals, despite having far more men, didn't melee. And when that happened, I said to myself, well, this game's over. If you aren't willing to melee 116 men or 29 men, you sure as heck are not going to be able to capture Midway. It just wasn't going to happen. I'm not sure where the breakdown in communication was in this game, or why the Federals were not meleeing, but it did not happen. And as a result, it really limited the Federal options during the last turn of the battle. And I think at this point, you as the viewer, you probably knew it was over for the Federals as well, and that they weren't going to be able to get enough men and pressure on Midway to drive back the rebels. They gave it a good try. During the last turn, they were eventually able to melee their way to Midway, but when you only have one chance to take an objective hex like Midway on the very last turn of the battle, you knew the Confederates were going to max out that hex with as many men as possible, and that's exactly what they did, and the Federals made it easy for them. And because of that, it ended up being a relatively easy rebel victory on turn number 28. But it really wasn't all that easy of a rebel victory when you look at the big picture, because the margin of victory here for the Confederates was razor thin. And I mean, if any game comes down to the final melee of the final turn, whew, that's a good game. And you know what? There could have been a roll of the die in which the Federals do take Midway in this final melee. There really wasn't a large probability that they were going to do that, but it was still technically possible. So I'm telling you, there is a chance that it could have happened. Now, when you look at the losses for the two sides, this really tells the story by itself. For the Confederates, they lost 40% of their entire force. For the Federals, they lost about 27% of their force. But where the story is really told is with the divisions. For the Confederates, you can see that A.P. Hill lost 40% of his division, while Ewell took over 50% casualties. Those divisions were really torn up because they were always fighting aggressively. Even Stark's division took 25% losses. And with Stark, every time he attacked, seemingly the Federals would fall back, whether that was north of White Plains or eventually against the Federal left flank above Midway. Stark was always looking for a battle, but the Federals never seemed to want to fight him. Now, over on the Federal side, you can see that Ricketts and Reynolds and Sykes all had about 25% casualties. And then there is King's division with just over 30%. Now, if I'm just being honest, King's division was by far the most aggressive in this battle. King did not mind taking casualties, and he did not mind attacking when all the odds were not necessarily in his favor. He knew that he had to attack in order to drive the Confederates back. And which Federal division was most successful in this battle? I would argue it was King's. King captured Brooks Corner, which granted was undefended, but then they were able to sweep down south of Midway, were able to drive back A.P. Hill's division for well over a mile, were able to then sweep around the Confederate left flank and threaten Midway from the south. King's division really fought hard in this battle, and their casualties and their percentage of loss really reflects that. For the other Federal divisions, they just were not aggressive enough. And I'm going to support that with a few numbers here. What I do in every game is I track the point losses for the two sides, and the reason that I do that is I give each side a point limit which they cannot cross. If they do cross that limit, it's considered a military defeat and they lose that battle. I just do that so neither side can just throw men into a meat grinder and then at the end say they won the battle despite taking 80% losses. I just don't think that's very much fun. Now for the Federals, they had a point limit of 4,500 during this battle. And they only lost 3,000 points, which means they were 68% of the way to their loss limit. So when I say the Federals needed to be more aggressive, I'm specifically talking about points. They could afford to throw their men into unfavorable situations because they had points to burn. It would be okay if they lost a Malay or 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 because they had enough points in the bank to where they could afford to take those losses. The Confederates, on the other hand, well, they ended up with 3,725 points with a point limit of 3,900, which means they were 96% of the way to their loss limit. Had the Federals been more aggressive and launched 5 or 10 more Malays, there is every reason to believe the Confederates would have lost this battle because they would have been pushed over their point limit earlier than 28 turns. I mean, the rebels were just 175 points away from being over their point limit. Over the course of these 28 turns, had the Federals just gained 7 more points per turn, they would have won the battle. So again, when I say the Federals needed to be more aggressive, this is what I'm talking about. When you are that far away from your point cap, there's no reason to conserve your manpower in a game like this. Be aggressive. Continue to push the enemy. There's only 28 turns, and when they reached turn 22 or turn 23, they should have really stepped back and said, we aren't anywhere near our point cap. Let's attack with everything we have, regardless of the situation, and see if we can't push the Confederates back or over their point limit. That would have been the thing to do. Alright, my final 2 cents about this battle. I always try to take something away from these multiplayer games, whether it's for my own use in later games or maybe it's something that you guys can use in your own games. In this battle, it's really simple. The Federals had to be more aggressive. I felt like they were always waiting for the perfect moment to attack, but there was always a problem. There was always some units in the way, there was always too much Confederate artillery, there was always something with the geography or the modifiers. They were just waiting and waiting, and every time they would wait, the situation would turn more against them. And it just reminds me of the old Wayne Gretzky quote that you can't score if you don't shoot. And that's what happened here. The Federals were just waiting, and they never took the shot, and they ended up losing as a result. You just have to be more aggressive in these games and know when it's time to move. The Federals had a window of opportunity a number of times, but they never took the shot. For the Confederates, they were really lucky at the start that the Yanks stayed west of White Plains, and I talked about that with turn number 1 in my review of that movement. Had the Federals approached on that easternmost road where the Confederates were not expecting them at all, it really would have changed all the dynamics, and the Confederates had no contingency plan for if that would have happened. And it would have been really interesting to see the outcome of this battle given those circumstances. But overall, the Confederates played a very solid game, and they took calculated gambles to win in the end. And I think that's the difference between the two sides here. The Confederates just really made cold, calculated moves. They looked at their point cap and made a decision consciously to throw men into situations in which they were going to be wiped out because they knew that they could do so and still stay just barely under their cap limit. It was a very calculated gamble that they made, and it paid off. And again, they knew it was going to be very close with points, and they accepted that risk. That's the difference here between the two sides. The Federals were not willing to accept the risk, and the Confederates were. Again, how close were they? Well, they were 175 points away from losing, and they were aware of that. During their final command meeting, that was a hot topic of discussion. How many losses could they take per turn and still win the battle? And during that meeting, the Confederates were thinking far enough ahead to decide that if they reached 3,800 points, they would immediately limber up, get everyone back away from the front lines, abandon midway, and just try to run out the clock without going over their point limit and accepting the draw. Again, they were making very calculated gambles from beginning to end, and it paid off for them, and they definitely earned this victory. Alright everybody, thank you for watching as always. I hope you enjoyed this battle. I surely did. I think it's probably the best one that we've had here with these multiplayer double-blind games. I do hope to bring you more of these videos and these multiplayer games in the future. It's gonna be a while. I've got some things I have to do this summer, but I should be back in the fall and in the winter with some brand new battles for you guys to review. Alright, until that time, everybody, just remember, keep gaming.